In the long, cold winter of 1944, with Europe torn and exhausted, there were nights when the sky itself seemed to burn, cities lay half-ruined, railways still smoked. In that winter, a single mission left a small airfield on the English coast. Routine by the standards of the time, unforgettable by the outcome. The aircraft was a 4-engine heavy bomber. Its crews polite and practiced at ritual, checklists, handshakes, last cigarettes stubbed into the dirt. They called her the Old Faithful, a workhorse patched and repatched, painted with the scuffs and scars of dozens of sorties. On board, 7 men tightened straps and breathed under helmets, young and silent in the dark. Tonight's target was strategic, a cluster of factories deep in enemy territory. Intelligence had flagged them as crucial to the enemy's supply chain. It was a mission that could shorten the war, Commander said. A mission that could cost men everything. The navigator traced lines by lamplight, whispering bearings. The wireless operator listened for static, for the faint hope of a friendly voice. On the field, the engines thundered. The crew leaned into the thrum, and the bomber rolled into the night. For an hour, reports would later show, they were simply one formation among many. Searchlights stitched the cloud layer. Anti-aircraft fire painted the sky in slow orange bursts. Then, shortly after crossing the coast, something changed. There was no explosion in the record books to explain a sudden loss. Radios recorded nothing unusual. Yet one crew never reported home. The bomber disappeared. The first search flights combed the cold North Sea at dawn, their pilots peering into gray water that swallowed silhouettes like a hand. Sonar crews swept the area. Rescue launches cut through foul weather. But the only things found were drifting bits of wreckage, small, ambiguous fragments that told more questions than answers. Official communiques labeled the aircraft lost at sea. Families received curt telegrams, chaplains read names at roll call. The silence that followed stretched for decades. Yet history, like water, finds a way into places assumed dry. Years later, after the rubble cooled and farmers tilled again, whispers began to gather like fog. In a small industrial town many miles inland, near an old river bend, a shopkeeper cleaning out a collapsed warehouse discovered charred scraps of paper, the blackened skeleton of a map, a corner of a navigational chart with a route penciled in by a hand trained in the RAF method. The markings were brief but disturbingly precise. They showed a path that did not end in the sea. The path led inland. When the story reached an amateur historian who cataloged veteran testimonies, the search reopened in a new direction. What if the bomber had not been taken by the sea, but had limped farther inland, under the radar of both sides? What if, damaged and desperate, the crew had attempted something no one expected, to bring their aircraft down behind enemy lines and survive? That single burned map, folded and hidden in rubble, was enough to resurrect the missing bomber from the grave of statistics and set a new, dangerous trail for anyone willing to follow. The trail that map opened was not a clear road, but a series of footprints in ash. There's always a danger in piecing together memory. Men forget, villages change, and pieces of metal get scavenged. Yet patterns appear when you look long enough. The map fragment was matched against wartime mission briefs. Coordinates overlapped with local accounts. A farmer who remembered his father returning with a strange dented metal piece. An elderly woman who spoke of nights when the sky glowed and a distant boom rolled like thunder. Local newspapers from that winter were combed in faded ink. One entry spoke of strange lights in the sky. Another described a night of loud thunder and the smell of burning. None of these accounted for a formal crash report, but they provided context. People in towns behind the front lines were used to air battles above their heads. They did not always report what they saw, especially if it could draw dangerous attention to them. Historians turned to maps. The burned fragment showed a route that arced inland, passing over a river valley and toward a cluster of low hills. Overlaying it on modern GPS, researchers identified a plausible zone. Farmland, patches of forest, scattered rubble. With metal detectors, 2 enthusiasts swept a single field and turned up a small, corroded bolt stamped with a British manufacturer code. It was tiny, almost dismissible, yet in a field where no other such metal had been reported for decades, its presence mattered. Eyewitness testimony can be brittle. People mix memories or infuse them with the romance of later stories. But when multiple, unrelated witnesses mention the same odd detail, a low-flying bomber, the smell of burning lacquer, A thud in the night that did not match artillery. A pattern emerges. There were reports of locals retrieving pieces of metal near a shallow depression behind a line of hedgerows, of children catching glints of twisted aluminum that became toys, of a farmer who once showed a shoulder strap carved with letters too small to read. The discovery of wreckage was slow and methodical. Archaeologists, with permission from landowners, began a controlled survey. Shovels uncovered fragments, a bent control cable, a shredded seat cushion with elements of flame sealing, a section of fuselage joint. None were intact. Each scrap told of violent impact and subsequent scavenging. Stories of locals reusing metal for tools or stoves are common across battlefields. Even the most tragic wrecks could vanish into ordinary life. Then came the hardest question: were there survivors? Inquiries at prisoner of war records turned up odd entries. A brief note of men captured near the region. An inconclusive list that did not match known missing crews. Names matched some details but not others. The fog of war is thick with such slips. It is possible that some crew members were seen, questioned, or recorded under different names. It is possible they were never recorded at all. What began as rumor hardened into a theory. The bomber, damaged and bleeding oil, had flown inland, seeking a field for a forced landing. Many crews preferred the unknown of enemy farmland to the certain death of the sea. The map fragment suggested intent. Not accident, a planned deviation, drawn when the crew realized they could not make the coast. We imagine the captain, with hands numb, telling his crew to prepare for landing. The navigator folding his charts under a dim lamp, remembering hedgerows and streams. The wireless operator trying, maybe vainly, to raise someone. The bomb aimer unstrapping his belt, whispering a prayer. Then the impact. Aircraft rarely land neatly when crippled. They cartwheel. Wings shear. Fuel ignites. Survivors, if any, run into fields watched by civilians fearful of reprisals. In occupied territory, silence could be protection. Excavation teams guided by new leads uncovered personal effects. A wristwatch with a serial number matching a squadron ledger. A pilot's insignia snapped in impact. A dog tag fragment with a faintly legible name. Each artifact was a voice raised across time. If the bomber came down on land, then the official record was incomplete. Being lost at sea means no grave, no closure. A land crash allows recovery, names, graves. In the end, archaeologists confirmed that a heavy bomber had indeed crashed inland, at the coordinates suggested by the burned map. Bones of metal, a heel buckle, an engraved watchback. Human artifacts that anchored the legend in truth. Researchers traced families of the crew and sent letters decades late. A mother who had died believing her son lost to the sea finally had her answer. He had tried to land. The bomber ceased to be an entry on a list. It became a place of memory. A modest plaque marks the field now. Inside a nearby museum, the artifacts rest behind glass, next to photographs of 7 young men smiling before a mission they would never return from. Visitors stand quietly reading the names, because some ghosts never rest until they are remembered. Months after the official report closed, another letter appeared in the archives of the Air Ministry, a routine communication, misfiled, yellowed with age. It mentioned an unidentified aircraft spotted by a German radar operator. The same night the missing bomber vanished. The operator's logbook, found in a bunker decades later, recorded a brief anomaly. Single slow-moving contact. Altitude falling. No IFF signal. Probable mechanical failure, then silence. No interception followed. The radar sweep lost it over woodland terrain. This was the first written clue that the aircraft might have survived the coastal defenses and drifted deep into land. Historians cross-referenced the time, weather, and trajectory. They matched perfectly. Suddenly, the mystery bomber's final minutes were no longer blank. What followed was a race between history and time itself. Aerial photographs from 1944 were pulled from military archives. Analysts compared grainy black and white images of fields and river valleys, looking for marks that did not belong. Scorched ovals, broken tree lines, strange shadows that stretched where no shadows should. In one frame, dated 2 days after the mission, there appeared a faint, circular scar on farmland, consistent with a large explosion or crash. Locals living there in the 1950s had planted crops across it, unknowingly tending the soil above the wreckage of a lost aircraft. When researchers returned to the site with ground-penetrating radar, the images came alive. Beneath the surface, the machine's ghost remained. twisted metal ribs, fragments of landing gear, and a distinct V-shape that no natural rock formation could imitate. It was unmistakable. An aircraft lay buried there, silent for 80 years. The excavation was painstaking. Each shovel revealed not only history but tragedy. Fuselage sections still bore rivet lines, recognizable patterns that matched the manufacturing blueprints of the same bomber model. One piece carried the faint trace of serial numbers burned into the metal. Experts verified it. This was indeed the missing aircraft from that fateful night. Its engines had torn free on impact. The fuel tanks ruptured and burned. Yet some parts, a cockpit lever, fragments of instrumentation, remained frozen in time, untouched by corrosion. For the descendants of the crew, the discovery meant everything. Families who had only telegrams now had proof, not only of death but of heroism. The mission had not been in vain. They had steered clear of cities, avoided civilian casualties, and died trying to save one another. At the site, archaeologists held a brief ceremony. Flags were raised. Veterans stood silent, their faces drawn with memory. The sound of a single aircraft, engine played from a speaker, a symbolic echo of what once thundered overhead. For a moment, the decades folded together. The earth does not forget. Beneath layers of soil and time, history waits not for those who look, but for those who listen. In the years that followed, the crash site became a quiet place of pilgrimage. Local children would ride bicycles past the small memorial stone, their parents whispering the story of the ghost bomber that fell from the night sky. Some brought wildflowers, others small paper planes. The museum that houses the wreckage displays more than metal. It tells a human story of courage, confusion, and choices made in moments when seconds defined destinies. Inside, the pilot's watch ticks faintly, repaired and set to the hour of the crash. Nearby, a faded photograph of the crew stands behind glass, smiling, forever young. Historians piece together the final sequence. The bomber struck by flak near the coast, one engine failing, the crew choosing to turn inland instead of bailing out over water. That single decision, to risk capture rather than certain death, gave them a chance, however small, to survive. Their courage reshaped the official record. As new documents declassify each year, the bomber's name appears again and again in footnotes. It has become a case study in aerial survival tactics and human endurance. For military scholars, it shows how discipline and instinct intertwine in crisis. For families, it restores names erased by bureaucracy. But for ordinary visitors standing before that display case, it speaks of something deeper. How history is not just written by victors, but remembered by those who care enough to search. Outside the museum, the wind crosses the same fields that once burned with flame. Birds nest where metal once lay smoking. Children play where soldiers once ran, and somewhere beneath the hum of distant traffic, there is still the faint echo of engines, a reminder that even in ruin, stories can rise again. The world has changed since that night in 1944. Skies once filled with bombers now carry passenger planes, satellites, and peaceful travelers. Yet every contrail across the blue sky holds a trace of memory, the invisible signature of those who flew before. For the 7 men of that lost crew, the mission is finally complete. Their journey through history ends not in silence, but in remembrance. And as visitors leave the museum, they pass a final inscription engraved in bronze. They flew into darkness so others might see the dawn.